Great, thank you, Barbara, and thank you for getting us started off that way. I'm also here today with Kathleen O'Brien, who's from town. She was leading the webinar last week, and she'll be jumping in throughout the presentation, offering some anecdotal stories to support our thinking through rich tasks in this past week that she's been doing with her own students. So I just want to echo what Barbara said as we get started. Thank you all for taking the time out of your day to jump on yet another Zoom meeting. We hope that the presentation that I'm offering you today is not just a place for us to all come together as a community in this hour, but provides you sort of a jumping off point in thinking about rich tasks in the virtual classroom, and ways that we can reflect on rich tasks back in our brick and mortar classrooms once we get to go back in. So as we begin, I just want to offer a timeline for today's talk. We're going to start off with a brief return to some of the anticipated challenges and opportunities in our virtual classroom that Kathleen offered us last week and reflect on those. Then we'll dive into a little bit of what do we mean when we say rich tasks and problem-based learning, so that this is an acknowledgement that we're all kind of living on three spectrums and we may not be on the same place in all of those spectrums. So the first being whether or not we're using problem-based learning in our classrooms currently and to what extent. So that's one spectrum that we all live on. The second is in regards to right now, how much are we meeting with our students? So last week, some of you said you were required to meet 3 times a week, others 5 times a week. So this is sort of the second spectrum that we're all living on. And the third is how much of that time is synchronous and how much of that time is asynchronous. And I want to acknowledge those because the power of rich tasks and the way that we're thinking about using them, we can adjust them so that it works with wherever you are on all of those spectrums. And so that's sort of an invitation for you to think about everything that we offer today as malleable and as adjustable for you and your students. Given that, we're going to go through 3 example cases, 3 different rich tasks that are unique both in their content that they cover and also how you might use them. So each one takes a little bit different kind of work to get going and asks a little bit different things of students. So we're offering those sort of as a range of tasks. And then finally, we're going to end with thinking through what a logistical framework might look like for you to implement any one of these or other tasks, resources that that we have to offer, and then hopefully we'll have about 10 minutes at the end for a discussion and questions. So to start off, thinking about challenges and opportunities in the virtual classroom. If any of you were here last week, some of this might look familiar, but we've built on it as we've learned in the past 2 weeks of what it means and what it takes to engage students virtually. Right? So the first thing is an exciting thing. We're not trying to do a one-to-one translation of the brick and mortar classroom into the virtual world. And we're learning what that looks like every single day as we work with students and deal with the logistics of getting conversations going, of handling, 15 to 20 students, having conversations in classrooms and things like that. And what we've seen is that there are lots of new ways that our students are engaging in material, and students who possibly haven't been engaging in this way person to person. So an example of this is that we're seeing that the virtual classroom is lifting some of the time restrictions on students and allowing both students and teachers some freedoms in terms of equity of time management. So students who typically struggle to move from class to class have the opportunities to get up and stretch and just check in with themselves in a way that they just don't have time for in the school classroom. And so we're trying to take advantage of that. And then there's also the opportunity for more feedback and different kinds of feedback from teachers to students, students to teachers also, because they have a lot to teach us about how to be online. And then also collaboration between students themselves. The second thing that we're seeing, and Kathleen's going to jump in here to explain the picture, is there's a whole new motivation behind asking students to explain their thinking.
Yeah, hey everyone, I'm Kathleen. Thanks, Sarah. So yeah, this picture is something that, a screenshot of some student work that I got last week. And if you look at it, the first three similar shapes were what I gave them, the black and white. And I asked them in small groups with a collaborative whiteboard to tell me if those are figure 1, 2, and 3 that I gave you, what would figure 4 look like? That's what you see in the red and blue to the right. And what would figure 0 look like? And I really, in those spectrums that Sarah explains, I'm very much a newish teacher. This is my 5th year, but I'm also comfortable trying new things while the virtual platform is new. So I don't have a lot of experience doing this kind of pure level PBL, but I didn't know what to expect. But what happened was the kids naturally jumped in and they were looking for patterns between 1 to 2 and 2 to 3 that they could then extend. I took screenshots of their online whiteboards and showed them to the whole class to discuss. And it just opened up this really vigorous debate. Kids had a lot more buy-in than I anticipated. And it just really opened my eyes into how all my previous lessons for like the past 5 years, how often I unintentionally squash their natural curiosity with what I think is scaffolding. When we were discussing this picture and comparing it to another group's work, I really had to bite my tongue because as a teacher, I really wanted to kind of take the students' comments as a prompt and then guide it through my Common Core benchmarks to like facilitate the conversation that would then cover all my points that I need to cover. But what I realized is if I just sat back and really refrained from commenting on each kid or reframing each kid's comment in a more useful way to me, I really just let the kids' conversation percolate and I let their natural curiosity to this problem, which again was way more than I anticipated, and just kind of facilitate wherever they're going with it. Then after class, I could tease out the few kids who made points I want to guide the class in. Yeah, so that's what that picture is about. If you can see, the number of tiles between figure 1 and figure 2 jumps by 6, and the number of tiles from figure 2 to figure 3 jumps by 12. So the debate was about, is the next jump going to be 18 because it's going up by 6 each time, or is the next jump going to be 24 because it's doubling every time? And like Sarah will explain, you know, you can use that to go in a lot of different directions. There's also this new motivation for explaining your thinking, which is that because of the virtual platform and because of the buy-in, the kids are forced to really be precise with their language and grapple with articulating the patterns they see from a really abstract, I know something's going on, I know there's an up by 6 thing, to a previously added tiles is now doubled for the next figure, you know, and watching them live try to struggle with that was really cool. And their peers' patience with them struggling with that articulation was really cool. Again, because I think it's not, you know, okay, you explain part C of question number 2 that I've carefully scaffolded, which the kids are, I don't blame them, sometimes tired of. It's more like, what is she gonna say? Is she gonna disagree with me? Is she gonna agree with me? So that was cool. And then I don't think I have control of the slides. Could we go to the next slide? Yeah, this graphic, if you were in that previous PD with Sarah and me, the graphic talks about, that was in the last one. And I just wanted to put in a quick word here before we go back to Sarah, that when I presented previously, before I actually taught virtually, this seemed really logical, that in real life, you're one teacher with 5 physical tables around you, and you're in a 50-minute time crunch, and then that's it. And you're trying to jump around tables to facilitate this discussion that's building. Online, there's this stretch where everything is kind of forced to have some kind of digital footprint that you have more time to digest. It is extremely exciting to be able to re-engage and comment and guide on student work in this way. But the nuts and bolts of recreating small groups in the virtual platform is really difficult. I'll talk about that later, but I just wanted to put in that little pin in case some teachers are like, yeah, I thought that would be cool too, but it really is difficult, and I'll just leave it there until I get to it later. Back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Kathleen. So I think that what we're trying to get at in thinking about challenges and opportunities is that we don't know everything yet. And as we continue to learn and continue to try and teach online, we are gaining insight into how to do this better online, but also we're gaining insight on ways for the future that we can support students once we're back in the classroom. So thinking about how can we take these lessons that we're each learning, come together as a community, create kind of a bank of lessons learned that we don't forget about once we return to the classroom. So the next section, we're going to go sort of briefly through what do we mean, or what do I mean when I say problem-based learning, and what do I mean when I say rich tasks. I might go a little bit quickly through this just so that we make sure we have time to go through each one of the rich task case examples. But like Barbara said at the beginning, you'll have access to all of this. And I was really intentional in putting as much of the information in the PowerPoint rather than my speaker notes so that you have access to it at the end. So problem-based learning, what is it? Right? So when I talk about problem-based learning, I'm talking about a student-centered approach to learning that's regardless of the subject. We're thinking about working in groups to solve open-ended problems. And these problems are the things that are driving learning, right? Rather than it being content given in a step-by-step or guided process that later has application. Problem-based learning is all about starting with the application, setting up the question or the problem and allowing students to use their prior knowledge and values, beliefs, and home knowledge to explore the problem and build new strategies and solutions, right? And so this image sort of juxtaposes the large, broad ideas of PBL and traditional teaching. It's not a better than, worse than case scenario. They're different approaches, right? And for thinking about engaging students deeply in ways that value their previous knowledge, we shift towards problem-based inquiry because it recognizes that the knowledge that students develop is not independent of them. It matters who is in the classroom and what we're talking about and what we've talked about previously, right? And so in that respect, participation in PBL is crucial, right? Collaboration between students and teachers, but also participation of all students. So within that, where do rich tasks fall, right? So Kathleen drew up this little image on the side that we're going to talk through, and thinking about if problem-based learning is an approach to education, then rich tasks are a tool or a resource to enact problem-based learning, right? They may not be the problem themselves, they could be, but a rich task might be a task that gets us into a problem of a unit. It might be the unit itself. It might be the assessment. And in that way, they're extremely versatile, right? On the left here, you'll see a host of theorists who talk about rich tasks. And these are all great resources. I think they're all very readable resources in thinking about what is a rich task and why is it important that we're using them in classrooms, right? So rich tasks maintain high cognitive demand. They offer significant content, which is thinking about what's their potential for what Heber calls residue. What's their potential for allowing students to connect back to previous knowledge and build new knowledge, right? Do they require justification and explanation? Do they support us in thinking about making connections across representations? Are they open-ended? And do they have multiple entry points and ways to show competence? So I offer this list both as a way for you to have connections to some teacher research out there that might help you in if you're new to rich tasks, but also I think that we can use this list sort of as a rubric or an assessment if we're already using rich tasks and PBL in our classrooms. So the wonderful thing I think is that CMP is a great attempt at doing problem-based learning and using rich tasks. And we could take many of the problems within that content that most of us I think have access to and assess a problem based on this list. And then if we see it fall short, well, maybe we need to make it more open-ended, or maybe we need to ask more for justification or explanation. And the point there is that we don't need to kind of reinvent the wheel when we're talking about rich tasks. We can create a rich task out of many, many problems we already have. We just need to work on adapting them to this list of key aspects of what we think a rich task is, right? And so as we continue in, again, I'm not going to read through all of this text, it'll be here for you. But if we think about what counts as a rich task, it must maintain academic rigor. It builds in differentiation. It promotes academic talk. So going back to what Kathleen was talking about, her students automatically wanting to have conversations about their thinking and who might be right or wrong, and how to determine that. Rich tasks are versatile. So the wonderful thing is they can be used as warm-ups. They could be used as independent practice. We could be using them as main tasks across an entire week or as an assessment. And in terms of assessment, we might be doing this very formally, sort of at the end of a unit, but we could also be doing this informally across a unit. And I think that the key, especially if you're newer again to rich tasks, remembering that spectrum we talked about at the beginning, thinking about, well, how do I start doing this and how do I think about where a rich task goes or how many times I'm supposed to be doing these, right? Rich tasks offer us not only opportunities to formatively assess our students across a unit, but they also invite our students to go deeper into the mathematics and to value and lean on their own knowledge, their prior knowledge, because they're so much more open-ended. It's not very clear necessarily what mathematics they should use to solve. And so it really engages, you know, a lot of the mathematical practices we think about in the Common Core, like precision of language and tinkering and being puzzlers. And I mean, we could go through the entire list. So rich tasks require students to move beyond what they already know, right? A rich task for a kindergartner, clearly not a rich task for a fifth grader. That doesn't mean we can't adapt a rich task, as you're going to see in the first example here in the next slide, for either third, fourth, fifth, sixth, all the way up, right? But they also require a culture of inquiry and persistence, both on behalf of the students and the teacher. So part of engaging in rich tasks is about what are you doing as a teacher to prepare, right? Are you spending the time to do the task as a learner first? Because otherwise we can easily fall into the trap, like Kathleen was saying, of guiding students into one solving strategy or one modeling tool. When the power behind a rich task is really to engage students in following their own trajectories and sort of helping them along the way to explore the trajectory that they're on. Kathleen, did you want to add anything to this slide before we move on?
Yeah, I was just going to add a couple points. So like Sarah was talking about with the guiding students kind of with a heavy hand, even if we don't mean to, I really had an kind of like an aha moment with this where I had blind spots here that were revealed when Sarah works with the town school. And so she came to my class a few months ago, and she just put up a picture similar to the tile picture I showed earlier. Just the picture, just the figures. And if I were to implement it, I would have normally skipped the like, what do you notice piece, because I wouldn't have trusted that there was much to gain there, and I'm on a schedule and I have stuff to get through and blah, 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 you know? So but Sarah was doing it, and she did do the, what do you notice about this picture? What question do you think what question could you come up with to answer for this picture? I was shocked that like the question that I thought was the obvious question, what's the price of each item? A lot of kids did come up with it, but there were kids who came up with way deeper questions that I wouldn't have come up with that we listed on the board. And there was kids that came up with questions that revealed assumptions they had, like, well, is the cost of the bat in that picture the same as the cost of the baseball bat in that picture? Whereas I would have assumed, yeah, every bat costs the same. So it just really opened up my eyes to, I've always known like that PBL and rich tasks have a lot of potential, but I could never make that leap to, okay, so how do I do it with my kids, you know? And I figured out with this kind of aha moment that you really have to trust yourself to just try it. It takes trust in yourself. You have to trust that the kids will buy into it. And I'm telling you now, they buy in a lot more than you think they will. And I think the huge key for me on this is that you have to trust that the kids will bring to the conversation their sophistication and their natural development of mathematical concepts, and they'll naturally raise a lot of the core concepts you're trying to get to. So I think if you start with those trusts, then it can go a lot more successfully.
Yeah. Okay, so this is the first rich task that we're going to go through. This is called the visual patterns problem, and I often will use this from Joe Bowler's website, U Cubed, but it's originally from a different author. I'm trying to pull up his name, Brent Yorgi, who at the time was a PhD student when he created this. And so in the times that I've used this have almost all been in person, and I might give students multiple copies of this as the launch of the task. And so what we're going to do is we're going to go through two different ways of launching the task, because I think that regardless of in-person or virtual use of rich tasks in PBL, the launch, how we begin the problem, is key and sets everything up for how students are going to engage in the task. So if I have a third through roughly sixth grade class, this is how I might launch the task. Right? So here we have the script up on the screen. I'm going to show you a series of images. I'm going to give you a moment to think about each one, and then I want you to draw the image you think comes next. You'll get to see the image that comes next, and then we'll compare it each time with what you've predicted. So we would start with just the beginning image. Students of these grades typically will say that they will correctly predict this image. They might put the circles horizontally related to each other, but almost always they will predict this. Then we'll continue on, and each time we'll pause and we'll make predictions about what comes next and also the relationship across them. Most often students by this point making relations to die. And so their next prediction is what a 5 on a die would look like, with the 5th circle in the middle. Turns out that the 5th image looks like this, which blows kids' minds. They're like completely thrown by the fact that it looks like this. And then they start to think about, well, what might 6 look like? Still, typically, students will predict that 6, again, looks like a die, when it turns out 6 in the image looks like this. So after the first 6 images, we sit and discuss and talk about what are the connections that students see across this. Most of the content that comes up is multiplicative in nature, thinking about the number of the image being related to the number of dots in the image comes up. And then after this, we finally predict the 7th image in the line. And then I give them the first 3 rows. And the only question that I ask them is, what do you notice across the first 3 rows? Typically in a classroom, they can spend anywhere from 50 minutes to, when I have control if it's within my own classroom, I've spent a week on this one question, where students are producing posters, they're annotating. And so I'm going to just show you a little bit of examples of student work that have come out of this one question, what do you notice? So these students prepared these posters. These were 5th and 6th graders after about 3 hours of work, in between which they had lunch, which many of them did not want to go to because they didn't want to stop exploring. But if we look across these, we can see that there's a lot of mathematical content that comes out of just pattern hunting in one image, right? We see prime numbers, groups of. So for the 4th and 5th graders, this is deeply connected to their thinking about multiplication and factors and products. And we also saw students that were wondering about whether or not the prime numbers had connections to what shapes were the overall shape of the image, which is extremely sophisticated, because when in fact this image, these patterns are predicted by prime factorization, which is not something that our 5th graders are learning about. But they were connecting prime numbers as important, even though they didn't have the terminology. Then the second launch is for 7th grade and up. And again, you might launch with your 6th graders in this way, or you might launch your 7th graders in the previous case. You know your students. But in a 7th or up, I might give the first 4 rows of the pattern, and then do a noticing routine where we talk through, well, what are some things you notice? They might spend 5 to 10 minutes thinking alone about the patterns that they see, the connections that they make across these 4 lines. And then the exploration launch is, what are the images in the next line? So they spend their time trying to figure out images 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, and 35. And then the final extension is, well, what is 36, which is the first image in the 6th line. This is an example of work that I did. These were teachers who taught secondary, and they were teaching the 6th, 7th, and 8th graders mostly. And I think what's really powerful about these posters in particular is not exactly what's on them, but when it occurred. So often we think about having congresses and discussions as our wrap-ups, right? We've done a lot of work, we've explored a problem, but this Congress actually happened in the middle of working on the problem. So we had 3 groups who were really convinced that the 30th figure looked like the top left corner, so that peace sign looking image. And then the other 3 groups were convinced it had more of a starfish shape. And so our Congress was focused around, how do we convince ourselves of which image is the correct image? Which image would the author say? And again, if we look across these, we can see prime factorization is emerging, thinking about which prime factor has the control over the overall shape and which prime factor has control over how many are within the shape. These are all prominent aspects. And we can see that there was a lot of different ways that the students were thinking about representing their work, right? And anecdotally, this these teachers returned to continue to work on this problem for another day and a half before they completed it. So we can see that the possibilities for engaging students for however long we might want to do it is completely possible. And I wanted to pause here and just talk a little bit about using these tasks during this particular time in our history and thinking about what our students are feeling each day beyond having to get their schoolwork done, but whose families are sick, whose families are far from them, who is, not able to see a parent because they might be an essential worker and so they're quarantined away from them. And thinking about something like this pattern problem, which on the surface is maybe a fun activity, but deep within it, there's so much content that we can explore, and we can invite our students into something that provides joy and provides distraction and provides engagement in mathematics in a way that maybe they've never experienced before, right? So this is just another opportunity for us to show that all of our students are math students, right? They're all capable of being successful at mathematics. And now we have an opportunity to engage them in something that maybe they haven't had an opportunity for before. Okay, we're gonna move on to the second example case. This is the ball, bats, and mitts problem that Kathleen was referencing just before we started in on example cases. So when I visited her classroom, I gave them this image and asked them these two questions. So we started with a noticing routine, and then we went into what could the question be? And what we saw was that, as Kathleen stated, this gives the students the opportunity to name what's interesting to them, to explore what's interesting to them. And we, of course, are going to get questions like, well, what's the baseball team's name? That are not mathematically answerable or answerable at all. But that's okay, because within that list, we're still getting a bank of questions that students can explore. And there are lots of different ways that we can utilize that bank of questions as extension problems, as challenge problems. We can return to them for discussions, or we can hold on to them for assessments later on. But the beauty of this is that we get that student buy-in because they've created the questions. They're things that they might be curious about. And we're sending an implicit message that the things they're curious about are valuable in terms of learning mathematics, that it's not just what question the textbook asks or the questions that we ask, but that they are capable of asking mathematically rich questions. So we have a little bit of student work here, and this comes from Kathleen's classroom. So I just want to, Kathleen, you can jump in here at any time, but I just want to read a little bit of what Kathleen's description of her students as we were about to engage in this. So I offered this task to her 7th grade classroom. It was a couple of months ago. She had been teaching from CMP and been striving for a PBL approach, but felt very pulled back oftentimes into more traditional scaffolding methods of teaching. So when I brought this problem to her class, they were just about to begin the unit for solving for X. And she shared that there was a lot of emotionally charged energy in the room about fears around being successful, that students had heard about the difficulties of introducing variables and writing and solving equations. So they were already intimidated with the ideas of equations and variables. And so I think that this task allowed them, and I think it shows in their student work, to dig into the concepts of equations, variables, thinking about equality and maintaining equality as we move things from one side to the other without ever introducing algebraic notation. And for her own students, she can talk a little bit about how this was powerful for them and how it set them up to be more successful in the rest of the unit. But also broadly, we know algebra is the gatekeeper for many of our students. It's the thing that holds them back from continuing on into more difficult mathematics, science, and engineering. And if a rich task like this, something so simple as 3 images, can give them the opportunity of being successful, then why not give it a try, right? And I think that the other point I'll make here is in comparison to the last task, we could see how this might be something shorter. So just just want to like make a note here that each one of these tasks, maybe some of them invite us to spend more time and some invite us to spend less time. But either way, they're both open-ended. They still promote all of the things that we named at the beginning when we were talking about rich tasks.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. That's totally accurate what Sarah was saying. And yeah, about teaching. So I teach 7th graders, and I'm sure other middle school teachers out there can feel me when I say, like, when you start to put X into things, you start to see a whole new side of your students. So I thought that this was like another kind of blind spot aha moment for me, which was that I thought any way that I would introduce something like a rich task, like look at these 3 pictures and what do you think the question is? Then taking those questions, picking out the one that says how much is each thing. But then you have this organic list of both extension questions and scaffolding questions or supportive questions to look at that the kids came up with. I'm kind of going on a tangent. So I thought that that any way I would do this I would want to do it well, but I could only see myself doing it in a way that took my standard way of implementing CMP and just like softened it or softened the concepts for kids that typically struggle, but didn't actually push the high flyers in any meaningful way. And again, I was so wrong about that. You do have to put thought into solving that issue. But what I found was that when we did it like this, it not only did give an entry point for kids who struggle with some of the core mathematical concepts, which is different than struggling with succeeding in our more traditional classes, as we know, but the high flying kids also had kind of a whole new freedom here, because I realized when I was before introducing things with X, equations, variables, you know, there was a pressure on some kids to know how to do it as part of their identity. And they weren't as free to ask questions or play or try something new. So when you introduce it this way, now the kid that everyone's going to look to because they always know how to do this kind of thing, they're now have a new freedom to play and engage, which was cool. And also the less scaffolding, the more open-ended, I was seeing kids who, again, I'm separating, you know, success in a more traditional rollout of math from success or kids that more naturally can grapple with mathematical concepts. The kids that it was just cool to see kids grappling in a way that I feel mimics more the real world we're preparing them for. You know, the question is not always scaffolded. Whatever they're going to work on in their life is not like, here's part A, here's part B, here's part C. It's so that's what I thought was really cool, that it both did make more of an entry for some of my strugglers, but it also offered a lot more to my high flyers than I predicted.
Thank you. So we have a little bit more student work. We offer kind of an alternative or extension task called balls and scales, which is very similar. We're not going to spend a lot of time talking through it just for time purposes, but I do invite you to engage in it as a learner. I've offered also these are the kind of the typical questions that emerge and the typical noticings, and so you'll get this in the PDF. So I'm going to move through it, but I would invite you to, as a learner, try and do both of these tasks and think about what kinds of strategies are successful in solving this question, in the questions that you're interested in here, in comparison to the ball, bats, and mitts problem. What students often find is that strategies for one don't necessarily work for strategies for the other, which again invites them to dig deeper and think about alternative methods of solving. Okay, so for our last example, I'm gonna, again, move through this a little bit quickly, but it's different yet again in terms of how we might launch this. So every time I launch this task, the only thing that students don't have anything in front of them at the beginning. We just have a conversation about these first 4 lines. And again, they don't have the text in front of them. We just talk about it. And the key here is talking about what are the key mathematical ideas, what's the key mathematical language, and the key contextual language, and making sure we get through those things so that we've set students up to support them. As part of your resources, I'll include the short article that this problem comes out of so that you can read in depth about one teacher's version of what a launch might look like. But we would certainly want to make sure our students understand, well, what a dance marathon is. So eliciting from students in a conversation, has anyone heard of this? Have they ever been to one? Talking about what is a pledge? What is it contextually in this problem? What do they know that word to mean? Oftentimes we go to synonyms of pledge like promise, so that students who may not have English as a first language or may not know the word pledge have connections to the task. We'll make sure to talk through how pledge connects to numbers of hours they dance, and that there's this alternative way to raise money called donations. How are those things similar or different than pledges, right? And as a math teacher, you might be able to see by looking at these 3 plans that this is very connected to thinking about linear equations with y-intercepts that are 0 and not 0, and thinking about steepness and slope. We could certainly be building equations, but the goal here is also to think about how do we support students in developing multiple strategies of solving. So the next 2 slides are just offers of how you might set this up to engage students. The first is 5-part problem, where at the beginning, the only thing that we're asking students to focus on is how can you give us a visual of each plan, right? So maybe they draw a diagram, maybe they're offering you a graph, maybe it's a table. But the idea is to help prepare the discussion for connections across representations. Then as they move through, the final aspect of it is, well, who has the best plan? And what we often find with this problem is that students have no one answer. It's clear once you do the mathematics that if they all dance a certain amount of time, one student does have the best plan. But then you'll hear students say, well, what if the other 2 team up? Which is a great extension because automatically we go into adding linear equations and we go into systems of equations. So this task, again, super rich in terms of both thinking about strategies and models. And the other part that I'll note just really briefly is that in this invitation, we will have students who are nervous with the amount of freedom that we're giving them. And so oftentimes we try and rethink about what our scaffolding is a scaffolding that supports students in engaging in that freedom, in the exploration, rather than scaffolding towards mathematical content. They'll come up with the mathematical content on their own. Believe me, they will. And we'll see that in some student work on the next slide. But sometimes we do have to help them along in thinking about how might we engage in a problem like this? Where do I even start, right? So sort of helping them avoid the mathematical version of writer's block. So the next 2 slides are some student work. And then I've also offered you some guiding questions. So you might be using these questions as you engage with students in discussion. But the key here is that we're thinking about what's the mathematics that underlies the problem, we as teachers, and we're trying to ask guided questions that connects the context of the dance marathon to the work that they've done. So we can see I've got students who've got some tables, who have done some mixed media here, who have used the blocks, and we might imagine how we could move from that middle image into thinking about if it's a student's first time graphing a linear equation, how easily we could move from those blocks into drawing the line. And again, these are some other options for what students have come up with. in thinking about how to compare plans. And all of this work came out of an 8th grade algebra class. Kathleen, did you want to add something on there?
Sure. Yeah, so this is, again, a slide that Sarah and I developed for the previous webinar we did together. And in the interest of saving time for discussion with the people on here, I won't get into too much of it because you'll get copies of these slides with these ideas. Yeah, the nuts and bolts of actually facilitating these type of structures online was a lot more difficult than I had anticipated. So far, the best, I'll talk a little bit about what I actually do, and then I'll just more broadly, but my school uses Google Meet for the video conference and Schoology for the LMS. I've been doing synchronous class 5 days a week. We haven't had a 5-day week, but I just can't figure out a way to do a productive class that's not just like one-way banking kind of learning asynchronously. But when I do group work so far, basically I create 6 extra Google Meet links on my calendar. Then I have the whole group meet with 1 link at the beginning of class. I do what Sarah's doing now with her slideshow just to show the agenda, like here's what class is going to be today. And then on that agenda, I include how they'll receive their virtual table group Google Meet link. For me, it's through email, which I have drafted and ready to press at the right moment. What to do when they get in their small group Google Meet, and what to submit at the end of class and how to submit. I do not pretend to have this seamlessly, but at least you can take that idea and build on it. My class time is 35 minutes. Usually it's 50, but now it's 35 in the Google, what I can call synchronous class time. Some other things I've tried I have a second computer. So I've tried having the class link that I send everybody at the beginning of class, like here, this is our class link. Then I have a second computer with like 6 open windows at the same time connected to each other Google Meet. My face is muted and my mic is muted just to, I think, take off some of the load on that computer because it starts to like get hot. And then I tell them, hey, I can't talk to you, but we can communicate through chat. So I've also realized like I can only communicate one way through chat. All I really do with that is to say either I type in the chat, time to go, class is over, or I might record the group meeting, which is another nightmare. But anyway, a little more streamlined than that is just to send them the group links after that whole group intro with the agenda, and then say, okay, I'm gonna be here in this room, pop in here if you have a question. That also worked well. So that's like the nitty gritty. I'm sorry.
I'm gonna ask a question. I know that Town does not use Zoom, is that correct?
Yeah, right, we use Google Meet.
Right, so, but I think Zoom would allow you to set up breakout rooms right within Zoom to do that group work?
Yes.
So,
I haven't done that with my class, obviously, because we don't use Zoom, but you're right. Embedded in Zoom is a much easier way to do that.
Yeah.
All of this.
For those who do Zoom, that might be a way to get around that, all those different links to different meetings. This way you're staying in the same class, you're just in breakout rooms, and then you as the teacher can pop into each one as you want to.
Yeah, and just from conversations I've had, even though you would think, again, that having groups on Zoom is easier, and I'm sure it is to an extent. There's still a lot of difficulties you run into. And I think that having your room where you say, hey, kids, pop here if you have a question, is just way more practical in the super tight time frame we have than as one person trying to jump from room to room. It actually gets really clunky and hard to manage with all the other like cognitive lift we have all day as just grown-ups. So anyway, yeah, I've also had a lot of difficulty trying to find online whiteboards, online collaborative whiteboards. My students say that the Explain Everything collaboration version is laggy, but I haven't really tried it. I just know that they already don't like it. So again, I'm just trying to use buy-in as like one of my main things. I'll wrap up quick, but whiteboard.com, W-I-T-E board.com is the best I've been able to find so far. Granted, I have not yet tried Jamboard, which is a Google thing that my school turned on recently. So Jamboard might be better, but of all the stuff, like Micro requires the kids to do a whole long login process, and Whiteboard allows them to just click on this, okay, you're together. There's no name, it's just like a animal and a color, and that's the screenshot that you saw on one of the first slides.
Thank you. So just in wrapping up so that we have hopefully about 5 minutes for questions, I've offered here a few resources. I'm going to add a few more that I've thought of as we've been talking before I send the final slides over that go out to you. But I think that there's been a lot of conversations, right, about virtual classrooms and going online from a more brick and mortar in-person, more in-person class. And I think that, you know, there are classes that are designed to be online. There are classes that from the get-go we're supposed to be online, and they have a host of best practices. And I think it's not realistic for us as teachers to expect ourselves or our students to be able to engage in online best practices for those courses. And so I think that for me, it's really important to end in thinking about like our best practices are care practices. And so, yes, I'm very deeply connected and very, what's the right word? I buy into the power of rich tasks as the way to think about engaging all learners with mathematics. But I also think about rich tasks as a version of care practices, because we're inviting students into a world of mathematics that maybe they have not ever really experienced, because it values their knowledge, because it invites them to explore and be curious in ways that textbooks just do not do. And with that, I think that my driving thought for the last few weeks has been, as a math teacher, mathematics for joy, mathematics for exploration, and mathematics for healing, for our communities, for our kids, for ourselves as teachers and learners. And so I know that we won't have time for all of the chats and questions that have been popping up as we've talked. But if you want to continue this conversation, if you want to think specifically about your students, whether those are students who are learning the English language and you want to think about adapting for those students, if you're working with students with disabilities and you want to be thinking about rich tasks for those students specifically, or if you want to talk about any of the stuff that we've talked about today, I am available around and eager to continue building the community together and thinking about rich tasks for our students and for our community. So with that,
yeah,
I'll
just
over.
That. Whoever wants to nerd out with me and Sarah on this kind of stuff, please email Sarah. And yeah, I just really would love to have like some kind of bi-weekly Zoom that we can learn from each other, so we don't, suffer the same exact mistakes when we could share. And I could share, like I have scripts I write because it's just so confusing to manage, and I could share those. So thanks.
There was a question here that Ava asked about, what recommendations do you have for group work on tasks like these with students with limited access to technology? They're only using their phone to do work. How do you have any experience with that kind of a situation?
Yeah, I think obviously it provides a little bit of an obstacle, but if we think about what do we have at home, what do our kids have at home that they could be using, manipulatives that they could be using, and then their collaboration might be, let's take pictures and send them to each other and have conversations in that way, and then we can be talking across those images. It's a little bit more clunky, but for especially for our students who either have limited capabilities in terms of internet or who might be sharing that internet bandwidth with many siblings, that's one way that I think that we can get around the bandwidth issue.
Great. And then there was another question from Rebecca, who, if you could clarify, there was you explained a fifth grade, it sounded like fifth graders who were doing a problem for 3 hours and then they weren't taking a lunch break, or they didn't want to take a lunch break. Could you clarify, how long are your actual classes?
Sure. So the classes that I do these problems with are in typical classrooms. I had the opportunity to work with the same class for a whole day. They were having it was sort of like a half teacher work day. And so the students worked in the morning. They were fifth graders, so we used their science and math hours. And then we had a lunch break in between, and then some students did choose to skip recess and continue working on the task that day. But any of these tasks could be used within a 50-minute period, or could also be extended across days. You just would need to find a place to kind of truncate it each day.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'll just add the thing about the tech. I just wanted to say, yeah, that's really real. And I think that if you're doing things asynchronously, all of this, Sarah has tons of experience doing this in real life. And I have 6 days experience doing this online. So none of us have a well thought out, vetted answer for that. And I think it just takes creativity, thinking about what could you talk to someone at home about, I don't know, but it just takes a whole new level of creativity and problem solving that we've not had to do as a community of teachers.